Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It's good to see you all. And we talked last time about Arthur Griffith and about advanced nationalism and so on. Today we're going to talk about, we talked about the fact that Griffith had nothing to do with the Easter Rising and so on. But today I want to talk a bit more about those people who did end up launching the Rising and were behind it, as we'll see. And how they held a far more militant vision than Griffith's Sinn Féin, and also had a much, much longer history. Now, many of them aren't openly hostile to someone like Griffith and his supporters and so on. But these people, we tend to call physical force nationalists, known really, I suppose the synonym for that is Irish Republicans, do reject completely the methods and ideology of constitutional nationalism. They believe absolutely that in military solutions and purely military solutions, and I can't emphasize that enough. That's a key thing. Purely military solutions without politics. So they're not, as it were, a political wing of anything. They're not just a military or a more radical aspect of a larger movement. They have their own history, which is the belief that only through force of arms are you ever going to win Irish freedom. That's it. And politics equals compromise. And the only thing, as it were, the British respect is going to be force. So they have, as I say, it's a very, very pure form of nationalist ideology, the physical force kind of strand. And of course, the people who are going to launch the Rising look back themselves in the same way the Home Rulers look back, as Daniel O'Connell or Parnell or something, a tradition like that. But they see themselves, the physical force side, as inheritors of a much longer tradition in many ways of, I say, physical force rebellion, which flows from various, usually abortive attempted insurrections and risings. One of these, of course, I'll just show you some of these actually here, is the one carried out by the United Irishmen under Wolfe Tone in the 1790s, very much in the context of the French Revolution and the Directory government and trying to, I say, Republicanism, which is a thing that's happening in lots of European kind of states, these kind of frustrated, progressive, liberals now trying to throw off the shackles of their imperial overlords, as it were. So you get this in Belgium, you get it in Holland, you get it in lots of Italian states trying to get rid of the Austrians and so on. So this is, it's fairly typical, this. And Wolfe Tone, of course, with the United Irishmen, had tried his own insurrection in 1798. Shorn again of, he was supposed to get support from the French. The Irish weather saw to that, it didn't happen. And again, it caused there was a lot of short-lived violence, but in the end, the British crushed it. Wolfe Tone himself, of course, famously committed suicide by cutting his own throat while he was in prison waiting for trial. But again, he made his attempt and it failed. And they follow it through other people. One of Wolfe Tone's actually lieutenants is this man here, Robert Emmet. Same thing in 1803. Again, a slightly farcical kind of rising. He attempts on a horse. He is in the middle of Dublin. He tries to rouse up, members of the Dublin working class. The whole thing turns into a massive riot. There's lots of looting and so on. And eventually he himself, Emmet, is arrested, makes a famous speech then from the dock, and is executed and done away with. So there's lots of these kind of groups. You could look at 1848, where we have an even more kind of absurd attempt. I call it the revolution. It's a bit strong. Basically, it all happens in a small patch of Tipperary, where a group of these young islanders, you have young Italy, of course, at the time, there's lots of young Hungary and so on. This is a young Ireland version, where, again, they attempt some kind of insurrection. And they're quickly put down by the local police and end up scattering. Many of them end up being arrested and so on. So I say many of these sort of precursors, as it were, to the Easter Rising and the tradition even of the Provisional IRA today look back at these kind of the magic dates, as it were. You'll always have 1798, 1803, 1848, all these dates that they have. But that's their history, and that's what I say, that's what they see. Many, many attempts now to overthrow British rule through force of arms. Many of them have failed, led to many noble sacrifices, and many martyrs emerge from this, many great speeches, as I say, are made in the dock and so on, but everyone kind of fails. The most important movement, though, is the next one on the rank, as it were, which emerges very much from Young Ireland. Many of the survivors of the Young Ireland Rebellion who end up escaping Ireland, and usually many go to France, particularly some go to the United States, is this organisation called the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the IRB. And this emerges, as I say, in the 1850s in the wake of this failed rebellion. Their core beliefs now, as I say, are the creation of an Irish republic won through physical force means. They share certainly this kind of romanticised view of Celtic mythology, again, typically late Europe, 19th century Europe, an imagined golden age before Ireland's subjugation under British colonial oppression or whatever. They have all that kind of stuff. But they also share particularly a kind of contempt for the current generation, the Home Rule generation, who they see as too complacent, too moderate, and happy to benefit from the land acts and the economic benefits of British rule, to the detriment of higher national ideals. That would be, I suppose, how they put it. These people, they know well, and at times, wear it as a badge of pride, that the vast majority of Irish people see them as dangerous fanatics, and share none of their political ideas. But I say their legitimacy for them is dependent not on contemporary tastes and the contemporary generation, but they draw instead on the imagined ideas of dead generations. They're who they're fighting for. And if you look at Patrick Pearse, what Patrick Pearse says, in his Easter proclamation, he talks about exactly that. That's where legitimacy comes from, the dead, as it were, and many of these old martyrs. And so on. So it's a very, very austere, very pure, very fundamentalist kind of worldview. And in the kind of Republican imagination, therefore, Ireland is a kind of eternal idea, if you want, that can't be destroyed or altered by the vagaries, as say, of contemporary political fashions, and so on. So they are romantic, they are ultra-nationalist, I suppose, you may be a way of thinking about it. And their ideas, therefore, are kind of emotional and sentimental. And if you look particularly at the role, I say they're always losing. They always lose all the time. Bad planning and always getting kind of riven with informers and so on. But they decide they're going to make their statement. Every generation must make its attempt at least, even though we're bound to kind of fail. But what you have is, I say, particularly in the defeats. Now, in the many of these defeats comes a kind of victory in the Republican kind of mindset. You particularly see this with funerals and so on. And I'll give you some examples of this. Stage managing funerals is something they're very, very good at. For some dead martyr, someone who died for the cause. So here's Patrick Pearse, as you can see here, in 1915, with one of the old guard Fenians, O'Donovan Rossa, who he doesn't die on the battlefield, as it were, he's just brought back to Ireland and buried. You'll see here as well Michael Collins. I'll talk about this all later on. He has another one of these funerals. But you can trace that. These are propaganda efforts that you get with these kind of funerals. But trace it up to this. Think about this. Here's Jerry Adams. Here's an IRA funeral now. Again, this is all about... So within the failure, as it were, often comes a kind of victory. It's an ideology which, because it's failed so many times, is kind of hardwired to fail. You must expect to fail. You have to make your gesture. You're going to lose. You're going to end up in a prison cell or on the gallows or whatever it might be. But you make your gesture. That's a very difficult movement to combat, of course, if it's hardwired in that sense to fail. And, you know, many of the leaders of the Easter Rising and so on will be brought up on this story and these ideas. Someone like Patrick Pearse, who will take this kind of utopian kind of idealism now to the extreme. I mean, into the realm of the spiritual, almost, someone like Patrick Pearse. Ironically, of course, he himself becomes part of that vision after his execution in 1916. He's added to the pantheon, as it were. But I say, they hate politics intensely. That's a big takeaway. And believe only in really purely military solutions. Now, I say, just to go back, I mentioned the Irish Republican Brotherhood, but just to show you the group itself, because they are very important, the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And here they are here. Founded in 1858, and I say emerges out of the chaos of the token rising of 1848, the Young Ireland Rising. Is created by one of the veterans of that rising in the shape of this man here, James Stephens. Now, and Stephens himself, I say, he'd fled to France, and he spends his time as hiding away in France. But when he's in France, when he's in Paris, he meets a lot of other revolutionary groups, and certainly learns some of their methodology and some of their ideas. And this idea of, as it were, conspiracy and secrecy. And the difference between the IRB, you'd say, and all these previous organisations is the IRB is far more akin to what we might think of as a modern terrorist organisation. In the sense that, well, the others tended to come out, as it were, into the field for a conventional battle. You know, they were quite open about, here we go, we're going to face. They always lost, of course. The IRB is a conspiratorial group. They're going to hide in the shadows. And secrecy is absolutely crucial. And you can see, you can see secrecy, conspiracy is the focus. And it's going to be controlled through a very elaborate cell-like structure of circles. It's wonderfully complex. It's wonderfully boys' own stuff when they write this down. But basically what you do is, see what we today call terrorist cells. The idea is you have a cell, there's a group of 4 or 5 of you, whatever, and the idea is the leader of that cell knows someone else in the organisation, but you don't know them if you're just a foot soldier, as it were, so that you can't be compromised. If your cell's compromised, it's only limited amount of information you could ever give to the authorities. See, this is this fear of constantly having informers and spies and stuff within the organisation and kind of doing it down. So I say it is kind of conspiratorial. Again, you can see here. Now, it has a Supreme Council made up of 11 members of this. And in 1867, it takes the momentous decision that the president, the leader of the IRB, is also the provisional president now of this imagined Irish Republic, which doesn't exist yet, but they're going to virtually establish an Irish Republic and make the leader of the IRB now the actual president in waiting, as it were. Now, it draws particularly its power, the IRB, and the reason I've got the word Fenians there is many people use the word Fenians, of course, in North America. And you know, I was once asked the question, what's the difference between the IRB and the Fenians? And you think that, well, there isn't one. The Fenians is basically a nickname for the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And Fenian is a term that's often used interchangeably but it's the IRB essentially. But we tend to call those members in North America Fenians, and certainly that's what people in North America call them, whereas those back in Ireland we tend to call the IRB. But it doesn't matter, it's the same organisation essentially. And I say what they do is they draw particularly on expatriate nationalism in the United States. And think about after the famine, we mentioned all these people going to the United States. By this time, they've begun to kind of establish themselves, a number of people have, you know, after the trauma of the famine and so on. And that becomes a source, as it does right up to today, of propaganda, of money, particularly money. And I say, so you have an audience there, you have a constituency in which you can potentially tap. And we'll see various attempts to do that. You know, Parnell, for example, goes there. De Valera will go there during the Revolution, and so on. And they carry out various, because they are a military organisation. They want to carry out, their own rising, their own insurrection at times. And there's various kind of wonderfully madcap ideas they have. One of these, and just to mention this, which happens in 1866, which is, comes from North America itself, which is an attempt now to raid over the border into British Canada. Again, it's wonderfully crazy. It doesn't really go anywhere again. But, particularly after the American Civil War, there's lots of young Irish men who are in the Union Army, particularly in the Union Army, also the Confederacy as well. And they end up being recruited to take part in this madcap idea of moving into, conquer Canada. The British are there. I suppose you're just going to attack them wherever they are. And if you're in North America, well, they're a convenient target. Again, doesn't really go anywhere. My old PhD supervisor, he told me that back in the day, he was brought in to teach in the H blocks during the early Troubles. Well, after late 70s into the 80s, and he was brought in there, and he was also brought into the internment camps and so on to talk to the IRA, these IRA internees. Which is a terrifying prospect that must have been, but to teach them Irish history. And I don't know what the idea was. The idea was maybe to educate them and maybe see the error of their ways or whatever. And he said he'd talk about the Fenians and the IRB and so on. And he said they just sat there sort of scratching themselves, yawning. They weren't interested at all because they knew this. This is what this is in their mother's milk. They knew all about this. He said until we got to the Fenian raids into Canada, they'd never heard of this. And they all jumped up very excitedly. What's this? We knew about this one. They're very interested. And he said to me, if the IRA ever do invade Canada, he feels that he'll be personally responsible for this. But again, yeah, it's a wonderful kind of idea. So I'd say lots of this. But the big rising, as it were, the magic date for the Fenians, for the IRB, is going to come particularly here. In 1867, this is what it's all leading to. So Stevens is trawling around, he's in North America, and they're raising money and they're buying arms and all their conspiratorial cells. But it's all about this idea now to launch a rising, which is going to take place in both Britain and Ireland. You'll not be surprised, again, typically, that it turns into a shambles. Poor planning, again. The authorities know what they're up to. You have, again, sporadic violence back in Ireland itself. Just skirmishes, really. Until once again, they're either arrested or they flee off the IRB. And it's pretty devastating, this defeat in 1867. It's so devastating that in 1867, in the wake of this, the IRB actually amends its constitution to say that in future there will be no further rebellions unless the people of Ireland express their clear support for them. That's how desperate they kind of were. So, but what happens with the IRB, those who survived, and again, this is a key kind of moment after this, is they now go underground now. And as they become far more like a covert modern terrorist organisation. You can certainly argue the IRB are, you think of the founders of modern terrorism, you have to put the IRB in there in the list, certainly. So they become very secret. And so far more from this, these are again the full-scale battles and so on, but this is far more now what they're doing, which, as you can see now, is dynamiting, bombing, much more like the provisional IRA in that sense. Launching campaigns on the British mainland and so on. The bomber in the shadows, the dynamiter or whatever. Again, the threat of the IRB, is it real? It's more like most terrorist organisations. This is the power of the IRB doesn't really have a massive membership in that sense. It doesn't have, the power to, as it were, bring down the British state. But as I say, with modern terrorism, it's the fear that it engenders in people. And certainly this is a period now where, you for the first time you get gates put on the front of Downing Street and so on, and cabinet ministers start carrying revolvers and things like that. But let's say the fear of the sort of bomber in the shadows and stuff. But I say it's a very, very modern form. And it takes part, as you said, we mentioned Parnell, the Fenians themselves and the IRB and this kind of bombing campaign, they're always around the fringes of kind of the Home Rule movement, at the extreme edge of it, and they would chip in occasionally. You can see the dates here. as the sort of, the stick with the carrot and the stick, they're the stick. And they would, again, carry out some murders and bombings and things like that, along with the Land League agitation and so on. This is, I say, the ability of Parnell to bring together this huge kind of alliance of different groups. But again, like with most Irish nationalist campaigns, once the Home Rule Bill fails and everything begins to fall apart, and Parnell himself ends up dying and so on, the IRB begins to kind of unravel. And certainly by the turn of the century, you'd say, the IRB is a heavily compromised organisation. Its membership, of course, are ageing, and this is important. And again, there's this image you get of the IRB, which is maybe unfair, but I say the idea of the old man's drinking club and so on. This is a moribund organisation in many ways when you get to the late 19th century. You can imagine these are younger men and now they're older, and I say they're living on the glories of the past. They had their go, as it were. It didn't go. It didn't succeed like all the others. But as an organisation, it still kind of exists. But there's no dynamism in that sense in this organisation. But what's crucial, and we'll see this when we talk about the Easter Rising, is it's exactly at this point now when, if you think about the context of the new nationalism, the Gaelic revivalism and so on that's going on, and the generation who's going to launch the Easter Rising, they grew up in that romantic nationalist milieu as well. And these are the people who are going to move now to revive the IRB itself, to become a kind of new IRB, as it were. Again, awaiting the chance sometime in the future for their opportunity to make their own particular strike for Irish freedom. And again, you can see here's Scotland Yard being attacked in the 1880s. This is, this far more like modern terrorism than, what we had before, men standing in a field and facing off against the local police or the army or whatever. It's very, very different. And I mentioned this waiting for the opportunity. Here's a very famous quote from John Devoy, one of the leaders of the Fenians in North America. And you can see, Ireland's opportunity will come when England is engaged in a desperate struggle with some great European power or European combination, or when the flame of insurrection has spread through her Indian empire and her strength and resources are strained. So wait now for your opportunity. And I'm sure you've worked it out by now. When the First World War comes, that's exactly what Devoy is saying now. There's going to be a time when Britain's back's turned, when its energies are going to be spent elsewhere. And that's when we can make our attempt now, our next attempt to do this. But I'd say the new nationalism, along with the, as it were, older tradition and the structure of the IRB, which still kind of exists, this is all going to come together. These young men schooled in this Gaelic radicalism and so on, they're going to come together and they're going to revive this organisation. And I say, when you look at people like Pearse and all his various cohorts and so on, I say that's the tradition they're going to essentially emerge from here. And so you can see here, just to mention Owen McGee's book, which is, again, a wonderful book on this period we're talking about, which is from the Land League up to Sinn Féin. So this period, after the agitations of the 1860s up to the 1880s, so after Parnell, after Home Rule, right up until the First World War and Sinn Féin and so on. Very, very interesting kind of book. But when we move on to the Easter Rising now, you'll see, the IRB are not finished yet, as it were, and will re-emerge, but in this rather different form now, with, this much of this rather romantic, idealistic nationalism, spiritual nationalism, as it were, attached. Okay, everyone. So next time we're going to talk about Irish unionism, which I suppose is the third force, if you like, in Irish politics. So we'll talk about that next time. Okay, take care.